So let's read through this, and let's sort of go through it piece by piece and do what we can to debunk it, and talk a little bit about the reasoning that he uses. So, and again, I want to give Shermer credit for his approach on this. Like, he's the most rational, reasonable of people. I know he's changed his tune a little bit on the younger Dryst. He didn't come across real well on the I think on the JRE podcast he did, this 961 with Hancock. But I mean, either way, I actually have a lot of respect for what he does. Okay, so, and this was on his Substack, Alternative Civilization and Its Discontents. An analysis of the alternative archaeologist Graham Hancock's claim that an ancient apocalypse erased the lost civilization of Atlantis. So right there, Atlantis coming into stuff. Like the term itself, and I'm not 100% convinced that Graham says this was Atlantis. I think that's certainly a term for a lost civilization, but we might be talking about a different one. I'm not sure Graham directly ties it to Atlantis, although Atlantis is the word that, you know, Plato uses and people use to describe a lost civilization. So, and we'll talk about Atlantis again, I'm sure, because he mentions it again. But note, in order to properly steel man instead of straw man Graham Hancock's theory, I sent him this article for comments and corrections, which he provided, and I incorporated here with. His full response to it and other commentaries and reviews will appear on his webpage in due course. So I'm going to give mine in a bit of a verbal format. In the fall of 2022, Netflix released Ancient Apocalypse, an 8-part documentary series written and presented by Graham Hancock, the author of numerous best-selling books about ancient human prehistory, with whose work I have engaged many times over the years, both in the pages of Skeptic and on Joe Rogan's popular podcast. The quality of the editing, graphics, music, and voiceover of the series is superb, the cinematography gorgeous, the aerial photography stunning. But the overall presentation so compelling that I binged watched this series twice. Briefly, Hancock contends that tens of thousands of years before ancient Mesopotamia, Babylonia, and Egypt, that is, deep in the last ice age, well, technically we're still in the ice age, we're just in an interglacial period, we've been in this ice age for a long-ass time, there existed an even more glorious civilization. Plato called it Atlantis. Again, I think you're drawing a direct line to Atlantis with this, and I'm not sure that's what he's saying. That was so thoroughly wiped out by a series of comet strikes around 12,000 years ago that nearly all evidence of its existence vanished, leaving only the faintest of traces that he thinks include a cryptic warning that such a celestial catastrophe could happen to us. The 8 named 30-minute episodes in the series, each with a catchy title, include Once There Was a Flood. I mean, as if it's like, what do you need, dry and academic? Catchy titles, not a thing. I mean, look at the title of your article, Alternative Civilization and Its Discontents. You're conveying a message with this here already, right? That's a catchy title, Michael. You're, how dare you? I mean, catchy titles. Because he mentions catchy titles a couple times. Once There Was a Flood. The Indonesian archaeological site of Gunung Padang is explored by Hancock, as he believes it was once inhabited by a lost civilization when the site was part of a larger landmass known as Sundaland, wiped out in a cataclysm. 2. Stranger in a Time of Chaos. The Mexican pyramid of Cholula, the largest such structure in the world that Hancock claims to show signs of a forgotten past, is also the source of the mythic hero Quetzalcoatl, who arrived by ship after the cataclysmic flood to bring ancient wisdom to the survivors. I mean, he's not disputing that. Photos of Cholula from the archives of Michael Shermer. He's actually been here, as opposed to other places.
And you've been to Giza, though?
No, I've never been to Giza.
Oh, dear.
Oh, dear. And from these pictures, I suspect this Cholula visit was a long time ago. 3. Sirius Rising. The megalithic temples of Malta show patterns of once having been connected and much older than archaeologists believe, and also demonstrate astronomical knowledge that Westerners also discovered in recent times, not to mention also the cart ruts and the other stuff in Malta. Ghosts of a Drowned World. The Bimini Road off the coast of the Bahamas, believed by geologists to be a natural rock formation, is argued by Hancock to have been an ancient megalithic platform and possibly an outpost of the fabled lost continent of Atlantis, now underwater but well above ground during the last ice age, or glacial maximum. Evidence is presented in the form of a map purporting to show that the ancients knew about the Americas long before Columbus. So, geologists contend it is shown on ancient maps, it is called out as such on ancient maps, and a tremendous amount of evidence. I mean, I don't think Shermer even gets into these points, which is part of the issues I have with some of the criticism against it, is that we have tremendous evidence from ancient maps that there was something seriously sophisticated going on in ancient times in terms of mapping landmass, mapping the planet, the coast of Antarctica, the Americas. All of this stuff exists on these ancient source maps that are now lost to us. Legacy of the Sages, the mysterious site in Turkey called Gobekli Tepe, agreed upon by mainstream archaeologists to be thousands of years older than any other megalithic structure in the world, is claimed by Hancock to have been constructed under the skilled direction of an advanced ancient Ice Age civilization, and not the mere work of hunter-gatherers, which is exactly what the archaeologists say it was, who otherwise would have been unable to construct such a monument. This kind of isn't true. Gobekli Tepe is not older than any other megalithic structure in the world. In fact, we're finding tons of megalithic sites in Turkey that may even be big. Karahan Tepe could be 5 or 6 times the size of Gobekli Tepe. And it's separated by, they think, maybe 500 years, 400 or 500 years. So not really true. And then there's this stupid argument that I've made a bunch of times about how instead of changing the definition, I even mentioned it on Rogan, how that they instead of changing the timeline of civilization, they just changed the definition of hunter-gatherers. As if hunter-gatherers were capable of creating these giant megalithic structures just on the weekend to get away from, the wife and kids. Animals carved in bas relief or high relief on the sides of the giant stone pillars are claimed to represent astronomical constellations as they would have appeared over 10,000 years ago. 6. America's lost civilization. Several structures of North America, most notably Serpent Mound in Ohio and Poverty Point in Louisiana, are claimed by Hancock to have much older origins than mainstream archaeologists believe, and incorporate a legacy of knowledge from an ancient civilization with advanced understanding of astronomy. How else do you account for the astronomical alignments and all of the actual data that's encoded in them? But anyway. 7. A fatal winter. Additional sites in Turkey include Karahan Tepe and Derinkuyu, an underground city with a vast network of tunnels, represent what Hancock believes to be survival bunkers for the people living under assault from strikes by cometary debris 12,800 years ago. And then 8. Last episode. Cataclysm and rebirth. Numerous geological features of the channeled scablands of the western United States show what Hancock, along with his colleague Randall Carlson, believed to be direct evidence of the cosmic cometary event that erased nearly all evidence of the advanced civilization they believe thrived during the last ice age. The series ends in dramatic fashion, with Hancock delivering a take-home message for us moderns. The comet stream will one day return to do to us what it did to the Atlanteans. Again, this direct connection to Atlantis. So we should prepare ourselves now. Perhaps our own advanced civilization should heed their warning, Hancock pronounces in prophetic fashion in the final line of the series, lest our own story ends the same way. End quote. Now, he's fairly complimentary here, but let's get into it. Graham Hancock is an engaging figure, drawing in his viewers and readers like one of the sage ancient wise men he believes once flourished on Earth. And to an American audience, his soft British accent, peppered with punctuated emphasis, confers intelligence and gravitas to his presentation. Well, why do you fucking think they hire all these English people to read on the news every night? But, your accent is your accent. It's like you're holding his articulation and his ability to speak well against him for some reason. Like that, so he's intelligent and he's articulate. What do you want? He is a warm, thoughtful, caring, generous, and intelligent man whose life work I find compelling even while rejecting its central premise. He's a stand-up guy who truly believes he has made an important discovery about the human past that has implications for our future. He is not the deluded wackadoodle pseudoscientist his critics portray him as, and most of the reviews of the Netflix series have been unduly harsh and thin on factual analysis. The Guardian reviewer, for example, described the series as the most dangerous show on Netflix. Dangerous? Two other articles in the next issue of Skeptic magazine review Hancock's archaeological and geological claims in detail, so let me here offer an overview of why I'm skeptical on his alternative theory of history, but also why I think there is a place in science for alternative voices to challenge the status quo. So full credit to Shermer for this. Obviously, he knows Hancock personally. He says good things about him. He's deriding and distancing himself from the attacks that have been made on him around this topic, which is good for him, and that'll only help Shermer in the long run. But it's not fit to line a bird's cage exactly. So anyway, I want to, this is good for Shermer for doing this. Now, let's get into it. So he has his arguments here, and these are the ones where I was reading it going, what are you doing? Why I am skeptical of Hancock's alternative theory of history. The Netflix series based on a number of Hancock's well-written and wildly popular books, again, note the catchy titles, including Fingerprints of the Gods, The Evidence of Earth's Lost Civilization, Message of the Sphinx, Underworld, Magicians of the Gods, and America Before. As with the Netflix series, I carefully consumed Magicians of the Gods in America before, and like the television presentations, I find the claims made within strangely compelling, at least initially. But are they true? Here are a dozen reasons why I'm skeptical. Okay. 1. There isn't just one alternative to mainstream archaeology, there are dozens of alternative theories. To name a few that have not fared well in the marketplace of ideas: the theory that lost tribes of Israel colonized the Americas, the Mormon archaeological theory that Native Americans are descended from one of the lost tribes of Israel, the claim that the Kensington runestones of Minnesota prove that the theory of the Nordic Viking peopling of the Americas centuries before Columbus, the Black Egyptian theory that Egyptians were predominantly black because Egypt is in Africa, Tor Heyerdahl's theory that the peoples of Polynesia came from South America, the archaeological theory that South American Olmec statues look African in their features, blah, blah, blah. The theories of Eric von Daniken, Zechariah Sitchin, Giorgio Tsoukalos, and other ancient alien theorists proposing that ancient monumental architecture is best explained as the products of superior extraterrestrial intelligence visiting Earth in the distant past. What the fuck does this have to do with anything Graham Hancock writes about? This is pure strawmanning. You're not arguing against anything Graham says. You're saying he did the exact same thing in the podcast. He's basically saying, look at all these fucking crazy people over here. Because you're not mainstream, I just bundle you in with them. And anything they say, I can use to argue against you. Because you must believe in the lost tribes of Israel theory. You must believe that it's aliens that did ever this. It's a complete. Then he starts off with this. It's as a massively disingenuous straw man. There's just nothing to be said more than that. This has nothing to do with what Hancock wrote. So let's note this, that when he says there isn't just one alternative to mainstream archaeology, there are dozens. Inside of archaeology, there isn't just one theory about A, B, or C. There might be dozens or competing theories about A, B, or C. Does that make them all invalid? Can you just point to, look at all you idiots who can't agree on this one topic, even though you're all academics? That makes you all crazy? It's a stupid argument. It's got nothing to do. Again, you're not arguing about anything Graham Hancock wrote or said. You're just saying, look at all these fucking crazy people that I'm just going to bundle you up as part of and say, oh, look, you're just part of this, a whole alternative scene, and I can dismiss it. It's nonsense. In response to this litany, Hancock reasonably responds, what does this have to do with me and my theory? The answer is nothing and everything. Nothing, because to his credit, he is just as skeptical as I am of these alternative archaeologies. Everything, because Hancock portrays himself as a lone rogue scholar being unfairly ignored by mainstream archaeologists, is he not? Whereas, in fact, there is a parcel of such rogues, all equally convinced of the veracity of their claims. So, most mainstream professional archaeologists do not have the time to engage everyone. Most mainstream professional archaeologists do not have the time to engage everyone who has an alternative theory about the ancient past. Even if they did, most are specialists in one narrow area of research. Find one who's going to fucking admit that. So the time to fact-check every claim made in a broad series like Ancient Apocalypse would be overly demanding, with little professional reward. They bitch and moan about the popularity of alternative fields. I mean, if you go back and read that SAA article from 3 years ago, they're literally scratching their heads trying to figure out how can we be more popular. And by the way, you won't find any of them that really admit that, I've got an expertise in a very narrow field. Maybe I should talk to, the engineers about the engineering of these artifacts, and maybe the construction guys about how these things were constructed. None of them are going to do that. They don't ever reach outside of that stuff. Yeah, so this is nonsense. This is like how you there's a parcel of rogues and therefore dismiss everything. There's a parcel of academics and archaeologists, dismiss everything. It's just, I could say the same thing with the same reasoning. Academics don't agree on everything, so dismiss it all. They're all wrong. Then I don't have the time to sort out the who, what's, whys, and facts of all of these competing theories. That'd be unduly time consuming and not professionally rewarding. This is a very, very silly claim to start with, I think. And then invoking Daniken, Giorgio Tsoukalos, those guys have their place. Zechariah Sitchin, who has been debunked, and then just invoking aliens and shit, which Hancock's never said, is just, it's the same tired old shit. And I'm sad to see him stoop to this, because it's the same tactic that John Hoops and Jason Covolito and these morons use. You have to talk about Bigfoot. You've got to talk about ancient aliens. You've got to talk about the craziest shit. I'm amazed they don't bring flat Earth into it. They might as well call Hancock a flat earther. 2, negative evidence and anomaly hunting. No matter how devastating an extraterrestrial impact might be, are we to believe that, after centuries of flourishing every last tool, potsherd, article of clothing, and presumably from an ancient civilization, the writing, metallurgy, and other technologies, not to mention their trash, homes, and bones, were erased? Not likely. I fucking agree. It's not likely. And Mr. Shermer, if you took the time to maybe investigate some of the engineering that is shown up, all of the anomalies, all of the contradictions to the technological timeline when you look at artifacts that come from Egypt, I don't know, let's say pre-dynastic vases and some of those things, and the evidence for overriding and inheritance, you might find that in fact we are looking at remnants from a very technologically advanced ancient civilization. So no, I don't think it was all destroyed. I'm pretty sure there's a fair bit of it still laying around out there if you just had the eyes to look or the eyes to see. It's so silly. It's like, are we to believe that it all disappeared? Well, what you're saying is that so all of this stuff is made with, pounding stones and flint chisels, and no, of course not. There's plenty of evidence for it, tons of it. The evidence for the advanced tools is in the objects themselves. We have the tool marks. We've got all sorts of indications that there was something super advanced going on way back in the past. There's the maps. There's the stories. There's lots of different avenues of evidence that suggest this. Not just, but he's making out like, oh well, there's no evidence at all. It's all just disappeared. And by the way, metal. I mean, I've talked about this before, but it's so fucking rare to find metal from anything Bronze Age or before. It just all got melted because people were looking for it, and if they found it, then it all got melted down and reused. Like it's so rare. There's only a tiny handful of tools and metal that come from ancient Egypt. This gold and shit. Gold's not really useful for anything except decorative purposes in ancient Egypt. But for damn sure, bronze and iron and all this other stuff would have been, and it would have all been used. Camera's struggling a little. Yeah, it's going to do that. Sorry. We're just going to have to deal with it. I'll try and lean back a bit, but I'm trying to keep the sun out of my eyes. But the sun will go down, and I don't know. It's just going to be what it's going to be for a minute. And the vase vid is going to be part of it as well, yeah. So the larger problem with such alternative theories, however, is that they lack convincing positive evidence in their favour and upon which they can be tested, but instead are based almost entirely on a handful of anomalies allegedly not explicable by mainstream archaeologists, along with gobs of conjectures about what might have happened to explain this or that archaeological feature. In skeptical circles, this method is termed anomaly hunting, and it's easy to do because no scientific theory explains every last bit of data. Anomalies may one day be explained by the accepted theory, or they may lead to a complementary alternative theory, or they may remain unexplained forever. Yeah, we should be searching out the exceptions to this stuff. And let's hold your breath on some of this stuff, eh? Because and I'm going to flop short of saying assholes, but if the mainstream archaeologists who actually control access to all of these artifacts, these objects, these sites, if they would actually allow people to go look and allow people to take measurements and allow people to do scientific testing, we might get a little bit further on this question. What he's not talking about is the fact that all of those things get heavily restricted on the basis that they're trying to protect the mainstream story. They don't want this type of stuff to be discovered. They don't want these artifacts analysed. They don't want to know more about their engineering or any of those sort of things, because all of the implications of that are totally going to contradict the mainstream story. So, kind of silly. Cherry-picking data, confirmation bias, and starting with a conclusion and working backwards through the evidence to make it fit. This is exactly the sort of arguments I see made from the orthodox side, by the way. But sure, these are never good approaches. Examples abound. And again, he's just pulling shit out of a hat that's got nothing to do with Hancock. Christian fundamentalists start with the assumption of a flood and go in search of Noah's Ark and evidence of floods. Are we calling Hancock a Christian fundamentalist? Creationists begin with a belief in a young earth and instant creation in 7 days. So they reject the theory of evolution and look for any anomaly in science that goes against the findings that support a 4.6 billion old earth. Are you calling Hancock a creationist? Does he believe in this? Does he talk about this in his show? Hindu creationists believe in an exceptionally ancient human timeline that dates back tens of millions of years, and therefore accuse the scientific establishment of suppressing the fossil evidence of extreme human antiquity. For example, the self-identified Vedic archaeologist Michael Shermer, in his book Forbidden Archaeology, believes his findings support the theory of humanity described in the Hindu Vedas. Who's this article about? Is it about Michael Shermer and his work, or fundamentalists, or creationists, or is it about Hancock? Like, same thing. It's just more straw manning, right? You're throwing up arguments that have nothing to do with what Hancock says. And again, by the way, cherry-picking data and using confirmation bias and starting with the conclusion and working backwards is exactly what happens in the mainstream as well. You have, the whole circular argument around, well, copper chisels and flint chisels and pounding stones are all we've found, so therefore everything's made by them. You're starting with a conclusion, and then you're just smearing it back across everything, despite the literal evidence against that claim is in the objects themselves, but you just dismiss that and say, well, no, we haven't found those tools, we found these tools, so therefore that was made with these tools. That's complete cherry-picking, it's confirmation bias. And they look at certain objects and say, see, this was made by this, and then they ignore things like, the saw marks and other stuff, and just, that's cherry-picking data. So this exact same thing applies in the orthodox world, in the arguments that I've seen made against alternative theories. And again, these examples have nothing to do with Hancock. That these challenges to mainstream science are wrong, however, doesn't mean Hancock is also wrong. We must assess each claim individually. He says this, yet despite two of his 3 points focusing basically on building giant strawmen. However, this does strongly suggest that if your alternative explanation is based primarily on the cherry-picking of data to fit only your preconceived hypothesis, and if it begins with a conclusion and then works selectively backwards through the evidence to make it fit what you'd like to be true, it very likely means that you're subject to the confirmation bias, or the tendency to look for and find confirming evidence for our beliefs while ignoring or rationalizing away any disconfirming evidence. Is he accusing Hancock of this? Is he saying that's what he's doing? He's not providing any examples. This is just spitting out. This is literally talking about people doing this, and none of them are Hancock. To be sure, Hancock is correct when he points out that many theories in the history of science have also been subject to confirmation bias, and where entire communities of mainstream scientists have prevented alternative challenges from getting a fair hearing. The system is not perfect. However, that doesn't mean every alternative theory to the mainstream is correct. It only means we must be vigilant. Galileo. The system is not perfect, but it's neither is Hancock claiming that every alternative theory to the mainstream is correct. I mean, he doesn't think that. You see what I'm saying? He's constructing these arguments to then knock down that have nothing to do with what Hancock is saying or writing. I mean, it's such a ridiculous... he's just ranting about nonsense. And I'm yet to see anything... Like I said, these aren't convincing arguments. Let's move on. Patternicity. Number 4, the tendency to find meaningful patterns in both meaningful and meaningless noise. Examples include matching the alignment of buildings on the ground with stars in the sky, which Hancock, following Robert Bauval, does in comparing the layout of the Great Pyramid Complex in Egypt to the constellation of Orion in the winter sky. Primarily the 3 stars in Orion's belt, really, that make up the figure's belt, is an example of patternicity. There is no independent evidence that the ancient Egyptians intended the layout of their buildings to match the constellation. Oh, I see. Interesting. So it's meaningless. There's no independent how many of these coincidences and alignments do you want to cite on these places, Tiwanaku, everywhere else, where they're in places where, there's no independent evidence that they literally didn't write down, hey, we're aligning this to the sky because this, and we know this. The fact that the Great Pyramid, literally in its ratios, embodies the polar radius of the Earth. When you multiply its height by 443,200, you get the polar radius of the Earth. When you multiply the length of its perimeter by 43,200, you get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. When you compare the ratio of the socle, of the perimeter of the socle to the perimeter of the base of the Great Pyramid, you get the same ratio in latitude and longitude of the planet, in terms of it being an oblate spheroid and being slightly longer east to west around the belt of the planet versus the north-south. They didn't write down that they knew that. There's no independent confirmation that the Egyptians knew that. So I guess it's just meaningless then. This is a fallacious argument. It means something. It means they were aware of the sky. It's not all of these things are just coincidences. And this is actually, this sort of goes further when you study the work of guys like Martin Sweatman, which we'll get into because he does talk about that in Gobekli Tepe. You can actually, if you're a statistician, and I don't pretend to be, but I've read Martin Sweatman's book on it, you can derive like sort of the statistical chance that these things might happen by accident, and it's literally billions and billions to one. The comparison between disparate cultures of artifacts and monuments from one society and then highlighting similarities with those of another to conclude a common source, when in fact they are more likely explained by independent invention, especially given common circumstances. Which is stupidity. If you look at, like we were talking about this on Rogan too, like megalithic walls, the polygonal walls, that's the hardest way to build a wall. It's I don't see you getting to that in terms of random invention. I don't see you making single-piece stone boxes with sarcophagus lids that match between Egypt and Japan, independently. Like, these things aren't... There's certainly cases of that happening, right? There are common solutions, like, creating spear points and shit like that. Sure, like that's, in creating sharp objects and flint napping. All right, that you're solving problems, but building megalithic walls, doing it with massive stones, like literally choosing the very hardest option every step of the way, making stuff from the hardest types of stone, that's not independently coming up with solutions to problems. That's not how you solve those problems. That's not how everybody would go down. You know what? Look, we're going to build a wall. We're only going to build it out of 80-ton stones, and we're not going to have any straight lines or make things out of the same shape. We're going to have them curved and then all sorts of little features, and you have to spend the time to match that and make sure it's a clean joint all the way through the depth of the stone. It's ridiculous. But he's saying, well, no, that's just independent invention. In many instances, Hancock rejects cultural diffusion, parallel invention, and coincidence as explanations, and instead strongly suggests that cultural features between civilizations that appear to match are the result of a common ancient source. Seems like a reasonable conclusion to me. His sought-after lost civilization. In fact, we should conceive of such similarities as cognitive commonalities in thinking about the world. There are only so many variations on a handful of themes in human life, so we shouldn't be surprised when people come up with similar ideas to one another across time and space. Look at the cultures around the world and tell me that's how it works. Look at just dwellings. I don't know, just off the top of my head, the way people build houses and shelter. It's nowhere. Nothing is common. I mean, everyone does it differently. The similarities of rituals and symbols, for example, does not automatically prove either cultural diffusion or ancient origin, but instead could be the result of cognitive commonalities. Go read Hamlet's Mill, bro. Like, man. I mean, it's true, some of this, you can explain some of it as cognitive commonalities, but it's like, there's so much nuance in this discussion, there's so many things that you can't explain through cognitive commonalities. Making flint points and making spears, sure. But some of this more complex stuff, the astronomical terms that keep repeating across culture to culture to culture, that all show the same numerology, that have the same numbers in them, even in cultures and where, they talk about cosmology and motions of the heavens in obtuse and referential terms, but even it's known that these cultures didn't have that ability to match the sky. Like, they're pulling that from somewhere else, right? So it's, there's a lot to this comment, and he's just sort of rolling it all up and dismissing it again as if none of it exists. There's plenty of stuff that seems to indicate a common ancient source, and that's pretty much the details that Hancock gets into in his books. If Shermer took the time to actually, address specific individual points, rather than doing what he does here, which is just rolling everything up and saying, oh no, it's all just cognitive commonality. John Taylor provides a splendid example of patternicity in his 1859 book, The Great Pyramid, when he computed that if you divide the height of the pyramid into twice the side of its base, you get a number close to pi. He also thought he had discovered the length of the ancient cubit as the division of Earth's axis by 400,000, both of which Taylor found to be too incredible to be coincidental. Other alternative archaeologists discovered that the base of the Great Pyramid divided by the width of a casing stone, equals the number of days in the year, and that the height of the Great Pyramid multiplied by 109 approximately equals the distance from the Earth to the Sun. So he's fucking wrong. The height of the Great Pyramid multiplied by 109, I mean, that might get you up to a pretty tall building. I'm assuming he means 109,000 or something, or more. And again, who cares? This is John Taylor in an 1859 book. He's not really repeated or said one single point from what Hancock claims. He's not addressed a single point, really, from what Hancock has claimed. In his classic 1952 book, Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science, and his discussion of the many alternative theories about the Great Pyramid of Egypt, Martin Gardner revealed the poignant problem with patonicity when, just for fun, he analyzes the Washington Monument and discovered it possessed the property of fiveness. Its height is 555 feet and 5 inches. The base is 55 feet square, and the windows are set at 500 feet from the base. If the base is multiplied by 60, or 5 times the number of months in a year, it gives 3,300, which is the exact weight of the capstone in pounds. Also, the word Washington has exactly 10 letters. This is just fallacious. 10 letters, 2 times 5. And if the weight of the capstone is multiplied by the base, the result is 181,500, fairly close to approximation of the speed of light in miles per second. Like this is just stupidity. It's the same argument that he's going to use against seeing patterns in the animals, in the stars around Gobekli Tepe, and that you can just find these patterns in anything if you look hard enough. Again, any serious investigation into the number of representations of fundamental constants in nature, things like pi and phi and the golden ratio, the dimensionality of the Earth, all that stuff, we'll find that there is far more involved in some of these structures than can be explained by just this sort of simple shit where you're going through 2 or 3 operations to get to your whatever 5 number and what's the significance of it? There's nothing to it. And he's also talking, again, none of this is stuff that Hancock claims is significant. What I'd like him to do is actually run down the list of things that they talk about with the Great Pyramid and try and explain that as just coincidence or just fiveness. After musing that it should take an average mathematician about 55 minutes to discover the above truths, Gardner concludes how easy it is to work over an undigested mass of data and emerge with a pattern, which at first glance is so intricately put together that it is difficult to believe there is nothing more than the product of a man's brain. In my opinion, the many patterns Hancock has found in the archaeological record lie not in the soil, but in his mind. Here are some examples from Marc Defant's analysis of Hancock's asterisms from Gobekli Tepe. Marc Defant was the guy who made an absolute ass of himself on that podcast, by the way. The guy who dialed in and just got mollywopped. It's the only term I can think of. So he's bringing up, all right, here's all the links to like Sagittarius and here's like, oh look, we found a teapot in Uncle Sam and we found one in a commando insignia. It's easy to find these things if you're motivated to do so. And again, if you really want an interest in this stuff and the relationship between constellations and these the artifacts that are and the bas relief carvings at Gobekli Tepe, I'd recommend reading Martin Sweatman's book, which is, he's obviously not talking about. He's cherry picking. He's accusing Hancock. This is cherry picking. I mean, there's significant statistical evidence behind the validity of some of these symbols representing constellations and astronomical alignments. And it's all detailed in Martin Sweatman's book. But however, he does have a link to purchase this issue of Skeptic right here. 5. Alternative archaeologists disparage mainstream archaeologists and accuse them of being close-minded dogmatists engaged in a conspiracy to silence the truth. Okay. This calumny is gainsaid by a paper published in the prestigious journal Nature just weeks before Graham and I collided in Joe Rogan's studio, in which scientists put forth evidence that they believe indicates humans, or possibly Neanderthals, inhabited the San Diego area of Southern California some 130,000 years ago, an order of magnitude earlier than mainstream archaeologists' timeline for the peopling of Americas. The evidence for this conjecture, however, is not as strong as the popular media made it out to be in the considerable press coverage that this paper received. The butchered mammoth's bones may, in fact, have been broken in the excavation of a road recently constructed at the site. This is directly debunked. It's literally debunked by the nature of the breaks in the bone. You cannot get spiral fractures on old bones like that. They break cleanly. The whole claim around these bones being broken with the use of tools relates to the nature of the breaks. Like the fact that he's saying, well, they were broken by a dozer, because we know it's 130,000 years old, right? They carbon date the bones. It literally can't happen that way unless the bones are fresh. Like this is... He's skipping the whole thing, and this whole claim has been extensively debunked by the people who actually studied this site. Now, no one's saying that the Cerruti Mastodon site's evidence for advanced civilization, but it is evidence for humans or Neanderthal or some form of tool use, right? They smashed up mammoth bones to get at the marrow. But it was broken by this bulldozer, which that's absolute nonsense. But of course, Shermer's not going to mention any of that. And the stone tools were nothing at all like the finely crafted Clovis points found all over North America. Nobody claimed they were. And instead might just be broken rocks. I mean, they literally used there was an anvil there and rocks and busted up bones where they were getting at the marrow. It's definitely tool use. Like these claims are just nonsense. This is exactly the same talking points that they used immediately when this claim came out, and then these talking points were addressed by the study's authors in detail and smashed. So that was, in fact, the conclusion in another paper published in the journal Paleoamerica after our debate as Hancock's America Before was going to press. And here's what most mainstream archaeologists now believe is the truth about to find. And is what most mainstream archaeologists now believe. Yeah, of course. Bulldozers broke it, yo. Because they don't. Well, why do they believe that? They believe it because they're not going to eat crow. No one's going to say, "Oh shit, we were wrong about Clovis first." And by the way, he's referencing all these Clovis mainstream archaeologists. Like he's not mentioning anywhere that like the 7 or 8 other sites that are undeniably pre-Clovis, Bluefish Caves. There's tons of evidence against the whole Clovis anomaly, but he's not going to mention any of that. Here again, we see the problematic practice of anomaly hunting. The vast majority of evidence indicates the peopling of the Americas happened sometime between 23,000 and 13,000 years ago, depending on the accuracy of the dating of those earlier artifacts and the margins of error around the calibrated date, again ignoring the many sites now that challenge this assertion. However, if people were in the Americas 130,000 years ago, where is the evidence for the existence between 23,000 years ago and a much older date? Where are their stone tools, their homes, their trash? Hancock responds to this plaint that the spiral of silence around challenging the Clovis first dogma has prevented archaeologists from searching for such chronological intermittent artifacts. This is actually true. In fact, many archaeologists reflect Clovis first and embrace the earlier dates for human migration into the Americas. Have they? So once the evidence became overwhelming, some of them did. So apparently mainstream scientists are not as dogmatic as Hancock would have his readers and viewers believe. Further, as Jason Covalito pointed out, he's a superhuman douchebag, this Covalito guy, pointed out in his extensive and detailed review of America Before in Skeptic, even accepting the most extreme pre-Clovis arguments, the presence of humans implies nothing about the existence of a lost Atlantis-like civilization. For example, Aboriginal Australians have been present down under for 65,000 years or more, but their traditional way of life did not include Atlantis-style cities. It's a false analogy. But he's right. In terms of, there's not like bones and primitive lifestyles, and certainly the stuff we found in Bluefish Caves and the evidence for human occupation doesn't necessarily mean, they built cities, but there's good reason for that too. Like the cataclysmic landscape and nature of what happened to North America. Literally the surface of the entire continent was changed. Like it was destroyed. You've got glaciers to start with, and then these fucking cataclysmic floods and events like the Carolina Bays. I mean, there's just very little. And there's stuff that you do have left, the mound builders, and certainly as you go further south into South America, and the evidence for fucking cities that's in the Amazon, who's to say, like, a lot of that stuff there's some similarities between that and what we find in North America. And the mounds and the structures that are still in North America show remarkable alignment and sophistication in how they were built. And who's to say that we built what's an Atlantis-style city mean? Like, does it mean a city like ours today? I don't think anyone's claiming that. Like, I think their civilization was vastly different to ours. Whatever that ancient civilization was, the high-tech one, their tech was different. Their entire lifestyle. I think we tend to look at this stuff and try to see ourselves in it, and we shouldn't do that. All right, 6. We're halfway there. I think he said he has a dozen. Falsifiability, conjectures, and refutations, and the burden of proof. And again, starts bringing in people that aren't Graham Hancock. In his 1959 book, The Logic of Scientific Discovery, the philosopher of science Karl Popper proposed a solution to the demarcation problem of distinguishing science from pseudoscience. The criterion of the scientific status of a theory is its falsifiability or refutability or testability. In his 1963 book, Conjectures and Refutations, Popper outlined how scientists operate by conjecturing ideas to their colleagues and considering their refutations in response. There's nothing wrong with making conjectures. It is the lifeblood of science. But most ideas that scientists, like all the rest of us, proposed turn out to be wrong. So constant dialogue and interaction with one's fellow experts in a field through letters and today's emails, phone calls, published papers and books, conferences, and the like are crucial for gauging if one is running off the rails. That is why it is dangerous to work in isolation, which is an inherent limitation of being an outsider to a field. It's not that outsiders can't or don't make contributions. In fact, that's mostly where the breakthroughs come from. Occasionally they do. However, they usually don't because most of the time are wrong about our conjectures, so refutations from colleagues are vital. Funny how he talks about testability. I'd like to see him, let's say, make a stone vase to the degree of precision that we've actually done by having an actual fucking honest analysis of the artifact. I don't know. Let's make a column. Let's cut a single goddamn granite block in half. You know, like none of there's none of that stuff's been tested. Half the theory is just made up nonsense that hasn't been tested and is easily refuted by an honest look at the evidence. Certainly when it comes to ancient Egypt, you could make the same argument about South America and the megalithic stuff all around the world, Baalbek, blah, blah, blah. These arguments work exactly the same. When you're deep enough in it and you understand the details, these arguments work the same way. I mean, you get down to these guys, tilting drill cores and textbooks to make it look like it. Cut a block? Nah. Get yourself a copper bar, some sand, go to town. The ancient Egyptians found it so easy. They did it millions of times. Just get a granite block the size of a refrigerator and go cut it in half. Tell me how you go. And then let's look at the marks that it leaves and have an honest analysis and scale it up and figure out the industrial scale that must have been required to do all the work that way. Why not, right? During our debate on Joe Rogan's show, I asked Hancock several times, what would it take to refute your hypothesis? I never received a reply, so I subsequently wrote to him, you still have no evidence whatsoever for the lost civilization. Not a single tool. No writing. Not even any pottery. Even after nearly 4 hours in Joe's studio, I still have no idea what you mean by advanced, despite my asking you repeatedly. Your comments were filled with many modifiers like perhaps, maybe, possibly, etc. It's fine to speculate, and you may even be right. But to overturn the mainstream theory in any field, you need to do more than that. Well, hold our hats, bro. Like, this is so stupid. Like, yeah. I mean, I know Graham doesn't dive into the engineering evidence to any great depth. He used to do a bit of that. I think he got sick of the pushback. But this pottery claim is so stupid. Same with the writing, for that matter. But there's certainly no pottery or tools, as far as we know. I mean, well, Antikythera mechanism notwithstanding. Telling Leon the matter of whether the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence in America before, Hancock writes, and he's maybe cherry-picking a bit here, when I wonder, will archaeologists take to heart the old dictum that absence of evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence, and learn the lessons that their own profession has repeatedly taught, namely that the next turn of the excavated spade can change everything. So little of the surface area of our planet has been subjected to any kind of archaeological investigation at all that it would be more logical to regard every major conclusion reached by the discipline as provisional, particularly when we are dealing with a period as remote, as tumultuous, and as little understood as the Ice Age. He's right. And I think you don't even have to dig to find this stuff. I think you just have to take an honest analysis and investigation into it, which they vehemently deny and disallow because they control access to all these things. So, agreed, but the burden of proof is on claimants to prove positive evidence in favour of their hypothesis. True. Not on skeptics to provide negative evidence, whatever that would be in the absence of evidence. It's funny. I actually agree with this. I don't claim that I know how stone vases and precision boxes and all these columns and obelisks and things were made. I don't know how they were made. You guys are the ones who are the claimants saying that you know how they were made. It's on you to provide positive evidence that they were made the way you say they were made, according to your hypothesis, which you treat as fact. It's never been done. Now, again, I'm a skeptic to the mainstream story. I'm a skeptic to this idea of this stuff was engineered with, pounding stones and copper chisels. It's not on me to provide negative evidence. It's on you to provide positive evidence in favor of your hypothesis of mainstream history. It's on you, not on me. Like, the burden of proof's not on me with that stuff, right? You need to match the sort of stuff, the precision results, the things that we're seeing with an actual honest investigation of these things. Nowhere in any of this stuff or in my work do I claim, I know how it was done. That's what the mainstream are doing. And the burden of proof's on them, and it's very much unsatisfied. So, And most scientists are disinclined to play burden tennis with claimants of alternative theory. Whack, the burden is on you. No, whack, the burden is on you. And so on. In the end, all archaeologists and skeptics will change their mind about Hancock's lost civilization when that spade upturns unequivocal evidence. Until then, it is reasonable to be skeptical. Exactly how I feel. This is exactly how I feel about the mainstream story. You don't have the evidence for it. It should be provisional. I'm very skeptical. You haven't proved any of it. You've cobbled together an interpretation of the evidence, but you don't have proof for it. The dangers of reading the past from the present. In researching Hancock's many claims, I consulted the professional archaeologist and skeptic of alternative archaeology, Ken Fader, about the symbolism found on the monumental stone structures of Gobekli Tepe. Hancock thinks these symbols represent stellar constellations or carry some deeper meaning about nature at the time they were carved. Fader replied, there appears to be a conceit on the part of modern people that all ancient art must in some ways be representational, depicting things the artists actually saw and experienced. But we don't insist on that for modern artists. Their art requires no concrete explanation. We allow them to be creative, imaginative, and to just make shit up because it's cool or represents stuff they hallucinated in trance and then interpreted through the prism of religion. Is that really the case? Do we say that about everything? Representational? I think it's mostly you guys that claim everything is representational and ceremonial, right? Isn't there a conceit on the part of mainstream archaeologists that say every damn site's ceremonial, every damn site's representational? There's nothing functional about these sites. Not possible. It's all just ceremonial. It was all just representational of afterlife rituals, of burial rituals, of interactions with the gods. None of this could ever be functional. Same shit. Fader added that the paintings of Magritte, if we took them literally, would represent, this is all stupid, that period when gravity was abolished, or at least for men in suits and apples. I know what he's talking about. The point is that we must be extremely cautious about reading into the past our own ideas, and the further we go back in time, the more problematic it is to do so. So these guys don't, for Gobekli Tepe, it's not just some random assertion of symbology. There's a whole book full of statistical analysis that goes into it, and you have to read Martin Swetton's work. They don't even mention it. It's extremely likely that it's not. It's extremely unlikely that it's not actually a representation of constellations and a cosmic calendar. I think that's hard science that goes into it. It's statistical science, but it is what it is. It's not just like some assertion or conceit. He is providing you some evidence that is what it is. The broad account of their interpretation makes me very skeptical. We have no dictionary for the symbolic vocabulary of Gobekli Tepe imagery. This appears to start with the assumption the figures are recognized constellations, several problems right there, and then goes back in time with planetarium software in search of a fit. Starry Night and Stellarium have a lot to answer for. They are dangerous weapons in the hands of amateurs. Can you? Oh, I know. I have the perfect quote.
You can almost hear the snorts of derision.
There you go. You can almost hear the snorts of derision at these damn amateurs. 8. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis as the ancient apocalypse. Hancock's proposed cataclysm that wiped clean the historical record is what's known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which scientists first proposed 2007 as an explanation for the North American megafaunal extinction around 12,000 years ago. It has been the subject of, this is hilarious too, it has been the subject of vigorous scientific debate ever since. And while there is some evidence for it, growing stronger every year, it may not have done what Hancock needs it to in order to account for his alternative history. In addition to the lack of any impact craters dated to around that time anywhere in the world, when the radiocarbon dates of the layers of carbon, soot, charcoal, nanodiamonds, microfuels, and iridium asserted to have been the result of the catastrophic event vary widely before and after the megafaunal extinction, anywhere from 14,000 to 10,000 years ago. Further, although 37 mammal species went extinct in North America, while most other species survived and flourished, not true. At the same time, 52 mammal genera went extinct in South America, presumably not caused by the impact. These extinctions, in fact, were timed with human arrival, thereby supporting the more widely accepted overhunting hypothesis. Oh my God. I hope you guys have watched some of Randall Carlson and people talking about this overhunting hypothesis. It's actually many more species than this. It goes down to a couple of species of birds, and it includes some of the most savage, massive animals that have ever roamed the planet. Short-faced bear, American lion, mammoths, mastodons, armadillos the size of Volkswagens, the giant sloth. This overhunt, there was more mammoths than people, they think, at that point. And by the way, this flourishing idea is nonsense. We now know that humans had a massive decline in population and in genetic diversity that's timed to the Younger Dryas. Like, these things, his claims are wildly inaccurate that he's making here. And this idea, he's setting this up like, oh, this is just a fringe theory that is not really, there's all this scientific debate about it. No. Go look at the 150 plus papers. There might be a dozen that are against it, all that were responded to, and all that knock those criticisms out of the park. In fact, some of the papers against it, like a requiem for the Younger Dryas, it shouldn't even be a scientific paper. It just makes spurious bullshit claims that were deliberately basically screwing up experiments, using the wrong equipment, all this sort of stuff to make some of these claims against it, because those are the tactics that have had to be engaged in order to try and get rid of this theory, and it's not going anywhere. Shermer's even had to admit on Twitter once or twice that, there might be something to it. So stupid that he's now, it's overhunting. And so what if, yes, there was tremendous climate change as a result of the impacts in South America, and lots of species went extinct down there as well. Cataclysms like this have far-reaching implications. And yeah, there's also, if you go back through the climate record, evidence for a lot of different events that happened around this time, like 10, 14,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 15, 20,000 years ago. Shit happened, but there is a specific event that correlates to the megafaunal extinction. There may be a series of impacts over thousands of years, but that 12,800 or 900 year event's the one that was the big one that knocked around the megafauna. There's probably other cataclysms that occurred that didn't have the same degree of impact. And this bullshit about an impact crater, we don't know about Hiawatha yet. I've talked about that in the past. Most of the work that's been done to date that as being millions of years ago is extremely questionable. It needs more research. And it's like you're saying that, well, the dinosaur extinction never happened until we found a crater. It was debated forever until they found a crater. And let's not forget, these fucking impacts were into ice, like miles of ice. Doesn't always leave the same type of crater than it would had it hit the ground directly. And yeah, how come there are still elephants in Africa? It probably was a series of airbursts. We have direct evidence for airbursts in some of these mastodon and mammoth sites, where you literally have these jumbled bones of mammoths, where you've got like a hip bone up near a shoulder, you've got ribs near the head, you've got stuff, and then the feet that were sunk in mud literally snapped off just above the base of the feet. Imagine the strength it takes to break an elephant femur. And because they were stuck in the mud, they were snapped off. It was like that some force came along and smashed them down into the ground. That's an airburst, probably. Like, some of these are definitely the result of like airbursts. It was probably a lot of airbursts and impacts. All of those things, like basically giant nuclear bombs going off in the sky. And he's going back to this overhunting hypothesis. So can you see why I was frustrated when I read this? Like, this is all of these points, for anybody that actually knows anything about this stuff, is nonsense. And some of these get better from here on, okay? The argument from ignorance and personal incredulity. This is the argument that if scientists cannot explain X, then Y is a legitimate theory. It is sometimes rendered as the argument from personal incredulity, because in this personal incredulity shit, because I cannot explain X, then my theory Y is valid. This is similar to the God of the Gaps argument that creationists use. Again, this is strawmanning creationists into it. In Hancock's case, the gods are magicians who brought us civilization. The problem here is twofold. Scientists do have good explanations for Hancock's X, e.g. the pyramids, the Sphinx. Bullshit they do. Even if they are not in total agreement, oh no, we should dismiss them because they don't have agreement. Like, that's what you said about the alternative guys, Michael. And two, ultimately one's theory must rest on positive evidence in favour of it, not just negative evidence against accepted theories. Oh, this personal incredulity shit gets thrown around a lot. And questioning mainstream narratives and the evidence that's cited, like let's take my field, like the whole ancient engineering and precision work. I'm not saying it proves any theory that I have. I'm questioning your explanation for it. The burden of proof is on you. Like, I'm not claiming I know how it was done. I'm saying we should be investigating how it was done. And I'm pretty sure that's similar to what he's looking at, well, there was an ancient civilization, we should be going and investigating a bit more to try and find more information for it, because there's all this fucking evidence for it. He's not saying that you can't explain it, therefore I'm correct. He's saying, look at all this evidence that doesn't match what you're saying. Tons of it. All around the world, from all these different vectors. from the cataclysm stuff, from the myths and legends, from the ancient maps, from the ancient technology, from the inconsistencies in the technological timeline. All these things, they all point to a common source. And all of this goes against your mainstream story. Therefore, we should probably go and dig and look and try and find some more, be open-minded to this idea. I don't think he's saying that, well, you can't explain it, therefore I'm right. Like, you're straw-manning this shit. I don't think anybody's making this particular argument. And you're also, like, jumping in and throwing creationists and shit again. Is that Turtle Creek wine? No, it'd be nice if it was. The bigotry of low expectations. Number 10. Hancock's biggest X is Gobekli Tepe in Turkey with its megalithic T-shaped 7 to 10 ton stone pillars, cut and hauled from limestone quarries and dated around 11,000 years ago, and humans lived as hunter-gatherers without presumably the know-how, skills and labour to produce them. True. They hunter-gatherers typically wouldn't be able to do that. Ergo, Hancock concludes, at the very least it would mean that some as yet unknown and unidentified people somewhere in the world had already mastered all the arts and attributes of a high civilization more than 12,000 years ago in the depths of the last ice age and sent out emissaries around the world to spread the benefits of their knowledge. This sounds romantic, but who is to say what hunter-gatherers are or not capable of doing? Well, apparently you guys own the book on that, right? You're the ones writing the fucking Wikipedia articles that talk about because before Gobekli Tepe, for damn sure this was not in their toolbox, but after Gobekli Tepe, mysteriously, the capabilities of hunter-gatherers somehow expanded to say, look, they could do this. Let's not shift the date of civilization. Oh, by the way, let's not mention that Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe were basically cities. There were buildings, there were cisterns, there were drains, there were quarries, there was all this infrastructure there. Not just a few ceremonial stone circles with pillars. There's a lot there, and you need civilization to explain this shit. But I can answer the question, who is to say what hunter-gatherers are or not capable of doing? It's you guys. You're the ones who own that. You say you own it. Like, you claim to be the authors and experts of it. There's your answer. To be fair, however, as Hancock told me in a requested response to this article, until the discovery of Gobekli Tepe, archaeologists did not believe that hunter-gatherers were capable of large-scale megalithic construction. True. That supposedly came later when established agricultural communities allowed surpluses to be generated, thus freeing up people to become architects, engineers, site managers, etc. Since the discovery of Gobekli Tepe, the old model of agriculture first, megalith second has largely been abandoned, but it was held as something of a sacred truth for many years. He's right. Finally, it should be noted, Gobekli Tepe was a ceremonial religious site. What was this thing about? Here it is. A conceit on the part of modern people that all ancient art must be in some way representational. I think there's a conceit on modern archaeologists that they say that every fucking thing they find from the ancient world was ceremonial and religious. As there is no evidence that anyone lived there, and there was no domesticated animal bones, no metal tools, no inscriptions or writing, not even pottery, all products that much later high civilizations produced. Sure, there's goddamn megalithic stonework, isn't there? And not every civilization looks the same, Michael. They may not have used stuff. They might have used stone vessels. We've actually found some of those there. They might have taken them with them. We don't know. The absence of stuff, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I think it was a point he used himself. Catastrophism and uniformitarianism. Hancock has spent decades in his vision quest to find the sages who brought us civilization. By the way, Shermer disparages some of this stuff with Quetzalcoatl, but there's literally stories of great civilizers coming, the seven sages and all this stuff. There is so much evidence for this across cultures that there was a rebirth and a reteaching of civilization. It's literally contained in the creation myths of cultures all around the world. Yet decades of searching have failed to produce enough evidence to convince archaeologists that the standard timeline of human history needs major revision. It's decades of head in sand is the issue. Hancock's complaint is that mainstream science is stuck in a uniformitarianism model of slow gradual change, so cannot accept a catastrophic explanation. Not true. From the origin of the universe, Big Bang, to the origin of the moon, Big Collision, well, Big Double Whack actually, Michael, there was more than one apparently, to the origin of lunar craters, meteor strikes, to the demise of the dinosaurs, asteroid impact, All right, we're getting to modern times here. We're only 65 million years ago now. We started 11 billion years ago. Now we're up to 65 million. To the numerous sudden downfalls of civilizations documented by Jared Diamond in his book Collapse, catastrophism is alive and well in mainstream science. What utter nonsense. Just ask Randall. All right, 12. Atlantis. The centerpiece of Graham Hancock's theory is Atlantis, a mythical utopian society that has been projected to have been located in the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, Iceland or Sweden, the Caribbean, or the Pacific, somewhere between Australia, New Guinea, and the Solomon. Okay. As the myth has it, the evidence for the lost continent was washed away when it vanished beneath the waves, but that hasn't quelled the imagination of Atlantean hunters. In 1954, the science fiction author and skeptic L. Sprague de Camp counted 216 different Atlantists, only 37 of which concluded that Atlantis was imaginary or allegorical, with the rest convinced the real lost continent could be found. In 1989, the French underwater treasure hunter Pierre Jarnac tallied over 5,000 book titles about Atlantis, but this was pre-internet. In his 2012 book Atlantis in the Textual Sea, Andre Albini reported that over 23 million web pages were devoted to the imagined lost civilization. There is, in fact, no point in searching for Atlantis because, in my opinion, Plato made up the story as social commentary on Athens and a warning to his fellow Athenians to pull back from the precipice that war and wealth were pushing them over. Well, that's quite an interpretation. In the Timaeus, Plato's dialogist, Critias, explains that Egyptian priests told the Greek wise man Solon that his ancestors once defeated a mighty empire located just beyond the Pillars of Hercules. This vast power gathered into one endeavoured to subdue at a blow our country and yours and the whole of the region within the straits. And then, Solon, your country shone forth in the excellence of her virtue and strength among all mankind. Afterward, however, there were violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared into the depths of the sea. It's quite a claim to say that he just made it up. By the way, this isn't the only source for the concept of Atlantis that fits the stories. I actually talked about it on the Rogan podcast. There are stories on the Edfu texts about the origin of the Egyptian civilization and their gods that also match the descriptions of Atlantis, of this island that sank or that was consumed by the sea. The fodder for Plato's imagination came from his experiences growing up at the terminus of Athens' golden age, brought about in part by the costly wars against the Spartans and Carthaginians. He visited cities such as Syracuse, featuring numerous Atlantean-like temples, and Carthage, whose circular harbour was controlled from a central island, as in the Atlantis myth. Earthquakes were common. When Plato was 55, one levelled the city of Hellas, only 40 miles from Athens. How often do you think he travelled 40 miles in those days? You walking 40 miles today, bro? And most tellingly, the year before he was born, an earthquake flattened a military outpost on the small island of Atalante. Like, what are you saying? Like, this is like you're just cobbling together random shit and saying, well, this was the reason he made it up. Yeah, Troy, exactly. Troy was a myth until it was found. This is weak source. It's just okay. You can say Plato made it up. That's fine, but you have no proof and there's nothing to really back up that claim. All right, I don't know. Out on a limb. I believe that science needs outsiders and mavericks who poke and prod and push accepted theories until they either collapse or are reinforced and made even stronger. Of all the alternative archaeology theories I've read, I find Hancock's to be the most intriguing, even compelling, in the romantic sense of Golden Age myths and what they may mean for us. Yet I do not think he has convinced professional archaeologists of the factual nature of this particular story, and that's how it usually goes in science. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Hancock's alternative theory of history is extraordinary, but his evidence isn't even ordinary. And Hancock doesn't help his cause when he reveals what he really believes about this lost civilization, which he outlined to Joe Rogan on the eve of the Netflix series At the End of America Before. Now we're quoting Hancock on a goddamn podcast that goes for 3 hours. I suppose the time has come to say in print what I've already said many times in public Q&A sessions at my lectures, and that in my view, the science of the lost civilization was primarily focused on what we now call psi capabilities that deployed the enhanced and focused power of human consciousness to channel energies and to manipulate matter. My speculation, which I will not attempt to prove here or to support with evidence, but merely present for consideration, is that the advanced civilization I see evolving in North America during the last ice age had transcended leverage and mechanical advantage and learned to manipulate matter and energy by deploying powers of consciousness that we have not yet begun to tap. In action, such power would look something like magic, even today, and must have seemed supernatural and godlike to the hunter-gatherers who shared the ice age world with these mysterious adepts. End quote. Now, I don't agree with Hancock here. But the key words, the key phrase is my speculation. He is speculating. He is not attempting to prove without evidence or support. He's just presenting speculation when asked. Now, Rogan did this to me a half dozen times. He's like, what's your wildest fucking speculation? And I gave him some of those examples. Like, that's pure speculation. Now, I don't agree with his speculation. I don't think it's that case. I think they had some forms of advanced technology. I think we see evidence for it in the tool marks. We see evidence, there's indicators of it in the capabilities, in the precision. I don't think it's like they just did that shit with their mind, but I don't know. I think it was some other form of technology, and I think the evidence is going to show some of that, particularly in the new videos and stuff. But here's the key thing. Like, Hancock's speculating, right? We're all allowed to speculate. You idiots in archaeology should probably consider doing that from time to time. People might find your shtick a little bit more interesting if they did. It is already a big ask, and this is Shermer, a big ask of professional scientists to go down one alternative path with you to the lost civilization of Atlantis, but when you ask them to do so by means of the paranormal or supernatural, you shouldn't be surprised to encounter substantial, hesitant skepticism. End of article. Like, quite a way to end it. You're literally throwing some of his speculation up there and saying, see, this is what he says did all of this. So there's evidence in the legends. Yeah, there's actually some evidence. There's stories of the monks singing the blocks into place, and there's stories of it. I know, but you could be describing anti-gravity. You could be describing a ceremony around some form of technology that they still had somehow working at that point. Who knows? There was something else going on, but whether it's psi or this other thing, who the fuck knows? But anyway, so there's, the comments are like, there's a second, he is comments like this from these idiots. He is not the deluded wackadoodle pseudoscientist his critics portray him as, but see, and then he quotes this psi capabilities that develop the enhanced and focused power of human consciousness. Come on, man. And defenders of Hancock seem to conveniently ignore his entire book about the civilization that was present on Mars and that he claims influenced Egyptian culture. Yep, he wrote a book about Mars. This guy's bringing up a la, Ron Hubbard promoting himself in such a way as to make himself wealthy and famous. It's just same team bullshit. Bringing it up. Anyway, so this whole article, though, really doesn't address even a single claim that Hancock makes. Like, doesn't address any of the specific points that he raises. It's a collection of fallacies, and it's a collection of just really poor arguments, I think, being masqueraded as some sort of skeptical analysis of his work. It's the same tactics that get used time and time again, and it's just bullshit. So, there you go. And, Shermer's doing his thing, man. He's getting paid. But yeah, I found the arguments to be extremely weak and almost had nothing to do with specifically what Hancock was saying. Yeah, it's, I don't know. It's one of the reasons why I'm really reluctant to kind of debate and get into, like, the tit-for-tat bullshit on the internet with people, because this is the sort of shit you get. You get endless fallacies, logical fallacies, whether it's nut-picking, straw-manning, appeals to authority. There's an endless number of them that I see deployed constantly. And you just end up pointing those out. Like I've done an hour and a half of reading this shit, trying to point out like all the fallacies and the inconsistencies and the way that arguments are constructed. Some people might find it convincing. I don't.